know so-and-so.
You're exactly right. And there's a reason for that, too, I think. Part of the reason for that is because when you're gay, you're gay. You're going to be gay your whole life. You're not going to stop being gay at some point. You're not going to just come to the point where you get out of college and say, okay, I'll stop being gay now. It doesn't happen. And so gay people basically felt cornered. They felt as though if I don't do something about this, I'm going to live like this my whole life. Sex workers, on the other hand, it's often something you only do for a short time. Is what something important?
Is this something important?
Is what?
What's your question? This is a book talk.
It's a book talk. Okay, anyway, as I was saying, the sex workers only tend to do it for a short time. Okay? A few years in college. I know a doctor, a vet, a psychologist, a criminologist, a physicist, and a couple of nurses who worked their way through school. Okay? Brooke Magnanti, who was Belle de Jour, right? She's an epidemiologist in England. And she worked her way through, she worked her PhD, all right, doing sex work. So a lot of the time, what people feel is that, well, I'm only doing it for a short time anyway. Why in the world should I expose myself for something that's temporary, right? For something I don't have to worry after this. And I think, I can't prove this, but it's just something that's kind of in the back of my head, that one of the reasons sex worker rights is now becoming more prominent is that with the internet, nothing ever goes away, right? So it's getting to the point now where even if you are only a sex worker for a couple of years, somebody can still find that old ad. Somebody can still find that old snap. Somebody can still find that thing, wait a minute, this is so-and-so down the hall in accounting, right? And so it's getting to the point where you can't hide from it. And I think that's part of what's making a lot of people begin to kind of go, maybe I do need to say something. That having been said, I'm not out at home. I'm not out because I live in a very sparsely populated rural area, right? It's not like living in the middle of LA. If I lived in the middle of LA, I'd probably be out all the time. Wouldn't matter, right? You vanish into the woodwork. But when you're in a very rural area, you can't really do that. But I'm out when I'm out, right? I'm out when I'm out here. And I think it does make a difference. I think people have to know. I think when people have somebody they can point to and say, well, she's normal. Right? We don't all have three eyes. We don't have horns. We don't have cloven hooves. And it's the same as it was with the gay rights movement. As soon as people realized they were not the stereotyped characters, right? That they were not these evil, child molesters or whatever, like the anti-gay people were trying to make them appear. And we've seen a resurgence of that in the past few years, haven't we? We've seen with the increases in the rights gay people have won, you've got these reactionary elements that have tried to reintroduce these old gay people as pedophiles and things like that, and it's not working. People are laughing at them this time. 40 years ago, nobody was laughing. 40 years ago, people believed that. Okay? Now they don't. And I think we're starting to see the very beginning of that with sex workers. The only difference is, instead of it being in person, it's more online. I know that having with a blog and being on Twitter, I've attracted a lot of people that might not otherwise have followed sex worker rights issues. And they follow me. And they know who I am. And So you have the situations where, well, like for instance, last year, a politician asked Walter Olson of Cato to speak to a sex worker about something. You know, Walter, do you know a sex worker who's fairly educated that I can speak to about this particular issue? I can't say too much because I don't, I want to keep the guy's discretion. And Olson said, sure, talk to Maggie McNeil. And he sent me an email because he had followed me on Twitter, right? He knew who I was. So I was able to get together with this politician on the phone and have a long conversation. He was able to consult me. A year earlier, he probably wouldn't have known where to go. But by me being out, even on Twitter, even on the internet, it was enough. It was enough for him to be able to make that contact. Okay? Even some of you, may have never talked to a sex worker before in your lives, or that you know of. You probably have, you just didn't know. Okay? But now you've talked to one. Right? And again, if not for the internet, you wouldn't have known. So I think that whereas the gay community was able to take advantage of things like television, I think for us it's the internet. I think for us it's that anonymity. It's being able to be out and not out at the same time. You know, you still seeing me here, you're seeing my face, you're hearing my words, you're hearing my voice, right? You shake my hand. But I can leave here and go home and you don't know where I'm going. You don't know where I live. And so I can maintain that slate wall. And that slate wall is necessary, unfortunately, in the present system of criminalization. Because one of the reasons that sex worker rights has gone so much farther in other countries than it has here in the United States, because when you look at the difference, you look at a country like India, you look at Cambodia, you look at Thailand, and they've made tremendous strides in sex worker rights. Why? Because in those countries, the actual exchange of money for sex is not criminal. They have laws around it. They have laws like you can't maintain a place of business where you habitually trade money for sex, because we're going to call that a brothel. And brothels are against the law. You can't hire anybody. You can't hire a driver. You can't hire a bodyguard, because we're going to call that a pimp. And that's illegal. So there are still problems in those countries. Okay, it's not by any means any kind of wonderland for them. There's a lot of problems. I mentioned earlier the case of in India where they were prosecuting sex workers' adult children for living off them, because that's technically pimping. So they have those problems, but at least in those countries, you can openly say, I'm a sex worker, I make money, I sell sex, and that's not illegal. They can't arrest you for that. Right? Whereas here, they can. And here, sex worker organizations have been threatened with promoting prostitution charges. In Arizona, where they have this horrible Project Rose going on, and I don't know how many of you know about this, but the quick and dirty version is that the cops are sweeping up people that they are profiling as sex workers. They're dragging them down to a church where there are these people that have this diversion program, right? They're telling them, you can't speak to a lawyer because you're not under arrest. But they're in handcuffs and they're being dragged someplace in a police car, but they're not under arrest. So the Phoenix branch of the Sex Workers Outreach Project was found out what the stings. And they went down to try to give information to the arrested sex workers. Basically, you don't have to participate in this. Have this information. This is know your rights, that kind of thing. The police threatened them with arrest for promoting prostitution. This happened literally last week. So these, when you have the very act criminalized, it makes it a hell of a lot harder to organize. Because most people don't want to put their head above the parapet, right? It's one thing for me, I'm retired. So the cops can know all day long that I'm promoting this, that I'm promoting sex worker rights. I don't have to worry about them finding my picture on that page and going, ha, we know who she is. But a lot of other activists do have that problem if they're still working. And then you have to make a decision. Do you feed your kids or do you promote a cause?
Swedish model.
You want to know about it or what? Want to talk about it? Say a few words about it? The Swedish model? The Swedish model. Does anybody here not know about the Swedish model, or is there know the Swedish model? It's being. This is the according to radical feminists and a lot of the Christian fundamentalist groups. This is the panacea. This is the way to destroy prostitution forever, right? This will somehow short-circuit human nature and make prostitution go away. Basically, the idea is, and this ties back really into my original talk, my original subject, because what the Swedish model says is that it is impossible psychologically for a woman to consent to paid sex. So let that sink in for a second. What they're basically saying is that women are basically so delicate and so silly or so romantic or so whatever that it's absolutely impossible for a woman to agree to a pragmatic transaction where sex is involved. Furthermore, that men basically are our moral superiors. And so if such a transaction occurs, it's the man's fault. The closest equivalent that I can think of to this is statutory rape laws. Right? When I was 15 and 16, I was sexually active with adults because I looked a lot older than I was. And it didn't matter that I was more mature than some of the guys I was sleeping with, because if we had been caught, he would have gone to the pokey and I would not have. Because he, by virtue of calendar years, would have been considered my moral superior. He should know better, even if I don't tell him. And this is basic what the Swedish model says. What the Swedish model says is, if you're paying for sex, which is mostly men paying, and mostly women receiving, right? That he should know better, and she, we don't care what she says. Even to the point where, in one major Swedish model raid a couple of years ago, one of the men who was charged in this sting was 17. So a 17-year-old minor was considered more legally responsible than the over 21 sex worker that he paid.
How do they treat transsexuals, transvestites?
They ignore them.
Because that just blows the logic.
Yeah, blows the logic completely. They also ignore female, they ignore male sex workers, they ignore female clients. But part of what the Swedish model is, part of the way it's sold, is that they claim, oh, the women aren't prosecuted. It's like, the women aren't prosecuted statutorily. No. In other words, they aren't brought to court and charged with prostitution. They are not prosecuted in that fashion. However, their landlords are threatened with pimping charges if they stay living there, and so they evict them. In fact, in Norway, which has also adopted the Swedish model, Norway had about 2 years ago a cute little thing they called Operation Homeless. What Operation Homeless was they spied on all the sex workers, found out where they lived, and then sent letters to their landlords telling them if you don't evict them, then you're going to be prosecuted for pimping. But this is decriminalization according to the proponents. Okay? There's also another rather nasty little thing they do, which is not in every case, but it has happened, which is where if the cops don't see the transaction taking place and they decide they need evidence, they're going to collect the evidence that that sex took place by securing the crime scene and removing the evidence forcibly, medically. I don't think I need to go into any more details about what that means. And that has happened in Sweden.
What are useful approaches that you found for helping people who have like really negative emotional reactions to sex work or their loved ones doing sex work come to terms with it as a reality? Like any kind of resources or approaches for discussion with them?
I think the example I use for that is the harm reduction line. A lot of it is about harm reduction. You don't have to like something to recognize another person's right to do that thing. Perfect example of this is that I personally am utterly repulsed by cocaine. I have seen way too many dudes doing cocaine while they hired me, and I can't stand the runny nose. I can't stand the crop that comes out of the corners of their mouth. I can't stand the way that they insist on changing rooms every 15 minutes. And no, let's do this position. No, let's do this position. No, let's do this position. No, let's move over there. No, let's move over there. No, let's go in the other room. No, let's watch some porn for 2 hours. No, let's go. I would rather go to my girlfriend's house now. No, now I want to move to a hotel. And this goes on and on and on. And it makes me crazy. And I got to a point where, you know, when guys want to know if you'll do coke with them, what they ask is, do you party? And what I used to say at the beginning of my career was, no, but I don't mind if you do. Toward the end of my career, what I said was, no. But, all that having been said, I do not support the criminalization of cocaine. Because I recognize and I understand that the damage done from the criminalization of cocaine is far worse than any damage the drug itself might do. And certainly worse than my prissy little feelings about it. Okay? I don't like airplanes either. I don't fly. I don't like flying. I'm terrified of flying, but I don't want to outlaw airplanes. Right? One of the classic gotchas that people will use to sex workers, to out sex workers, is, what about your daughter? What if your daughter wanted to do it? And they think they've got you when they say this. My response to this is, A, do you believe, honestly, that you have control over your adult children? Because if you think that, you're living in a fantasy land, right? Nobody controls their adult children. All you can do is present an example, try to bring them up what you consider right, and stand back and hope, right? What you do at that point is you have to turn the question around on them. You have to say, if, in spite of your efforts, your daughter became a sex worker, do you want her pursued by cops? Do you want her tricked? Do you want her raped to find something, an excuse to arrest her? Do you want her to have to do business in such a way that she can't hire a bodyguard, that she can't have a friend, that she has to hide? Do you want it to where if a crime against her does happen, she can't report it to the police? She can't report being robbed? She can't report being assaulted? Because I guarantee you, I'll tell you what happens when a sex worker reports any kind of crime at all. She is arrested immediately, and that's as far as it goes. It stops there. The harm reduction model basically says, even if you don't like something, you don't have to like it. just like I don't have to like cocaine, for us to understand as adults and as civilized people that doesn't give us the right to send armed thugs to beat people up and throw them in a cage to stop that thing, in a vain effort to stop that thing.
Yeah, I guess that means people who have a negative reaction to it, like, people who have a negative emotional reaction to it, like, they should still probably care about it not being criminalized. And I guess I'm curious about ways to try and, like, show them that it still is important for them to care about it not being criminalized, even though it's not their favorite thing. Like, things that might matter to them, or might, like, overcome the negative emotional reaction.
That's really what my whole talk was intended to be here tonight. It's just basically, in other words, you have to do it, I think, by examples. I think you have to basically say to people, this is how it affects you. Like the lady, like the mother of my stripper friend. All right? She had never been a sex worker. She was tolerant of her daughter being a stripper. It was cool to her. It was fine. But she'd never been a sex worker herself, and yet she was arrested, wasn't she? Okay? There was a lady, I had to laugh. In Australia, the different states in Australia are like, they have a federal system like we do. All right, the states are in charge of criminal law. And so Australia has the different states have different approaches to prostitution law. In one of the states, I don't remember which state this one was in. I think it was Western Australia. They were having a crackdown on street prostitution. And so the cops kept arresting everybody they were profiling as being street prostitutes. And this woman went on the news in Australia because she was some kind of like a real estate agent or something, and she'd been popped like 4 times by the cops. And of course, what does she say to the news? Do I look like a prostitute? And of course, this is that mindset, isn't it? What does a prostitute look like? She thinks that there's a distinctive look, and there isn't. And that's what people don't get, is that it's not about what really is. It's about what cops think and what cops say. If you strike a cop as a hooker for whatever reason, whether you are, whether you aren't, or even if he just wants to do that to you, even if he just wants to use that as a club against you, because there have been cases of that too. I mean, if I wanted to list all the different ways, this talk would have been 4 hours long, because there's numerous ways. There was a cop up in New York who was actually arresting, or rather not arresting, but he was extorting sex out of women by telling them that he was going to report them he was going to arrest them as prostitutes. This was not prostitutes, this was just ordinary women. That he was going to, unless they put out, he was going to run them in. Because again, it's a he said, she said. It's whatever the cop says. And when you and the cop are standing in front of the judge, and you say one thing, and he says something completely outlandish, guess which one the judge is going to believe?
I think that there's also another class of victims under criminalization that we're not talking about, and I'd love for you to give a few words on Sweet Jasmine, Jenna Jameson, and their children that have been affected, and the state of, family law when it comes to sex workers.
That's a very good point. Because of the good old reliable Madonna whore belief, the idea has arisen that a whore is a completely different kind of person from a mother. Now, this is a load of dingo's kidneys, as the late Douglas Adams would have put it, because 70% of sex workers have children. And in fact, many of them turn to sex work to support children. When I had my agency, I had no fewer than 3 that I can remember off the top of my head that specifically started sex working because they had children to support and couldn't do it any other way. But what happens is, when a sex worker gets involved in a custody case, or sometimes even just being arrested, you'll very often see these things where, and you kind of, I think libertarians mostly learn to read police reports a little bit more skeptically than members of the general population, right? But it's the same thing with us, with sex workers. We learn to read those police reports pretty skeptically. And so one of the things you'll see is they'll say, oh, well, the police arrested two prostitutes and a pimp and rescued 3 children. And what rescued children means is they abducted the sex workers' children. And then they call them, they pretend that those children were being used as child prostitutes. But the truth is, they were just your kids. They may not have even been there. They may have gotten her address off her driver's license and gone to her house and abducted them from the city. Okay? And this happens all the time. And very often, when a sex worker loses her children because of one of these abductions, or because of a custody case, where the spouse, of course, in an acrimonious divorce, the spouse may say, well, guess what? She's a sex worker. And then, of course, what does the judge do? Then it doesn't matter at that point what the spouse may have wrong, right? Because, hey, even if the spouse is a wife beater, well, that's better than a hooker. So that's Jenna Jameson, that Kelly mentioned. Jenna Jameson was a very famous porn star. You know, definitely about as distant in the hierarchy as you can get from those girls that the police are rescuing their kids. And guess what? She lost her kids in a custody battle with her ex. Because being a millionaire businesswoman was apparently not enough. Because being a sex worker, and one of the terms I use in my blog for this is kind of a comical term for a serious thing. I talk about sex rays. That the sex workers obviously put out sex rays that damage children somehow, and so that if we get anywhere near children, you know, they're contaminated by these sex rays, and I don't know what's supposed to happen to them, but something awful. So it even gets to the point where you have things like crazy stuff. Like, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with Airbnb. There's been a controversy lately where new technologies, sex workers often discover new technology before everybody else does. Airbnb we've been using for years to basically create nicer spaces. Right? You can receive a client in a nice apartment instead of in a hotel. And you don't have eyes watching you as much. You don't have these hotel staff kind of, peering over your shoulder. Well, what happened, unfortunately, was that one escort in New York got in an argument with a client and he stabbed her. And so obviously the police got involved. And it became this big, huge scandal. And Airbnb put the woman, the owner of the apartment, up in like an expensive hotel for a week while they completely refurbished her apartment. Because obviously the sex worker being there, because paid sex emitted some sort of dangerous radiation into her bedding and stuff that ordinary people, who are not getting paid for sex somehow doesn't do that. And I'm not quite sure, but there you are. Well, 2 of them. You haven't asked one yet, so we'll go with you.
You touched on the Somali mom thing earlier, and I know you've written about it. But when I was reading the mainstream articles about her organization, I was really happy to see that they're starting to talk about the connections to the garment industry and how these basically anti-trafficking organizations are literally trafficking women into non-sex, sweatshop slavery. And the corollary to that is, I know you mentioned on your blog that you think that this this trafficking narrative is going to eventually, very soon, start going away like the Satanic Panic did. And I was wondering if this has changed your timetable or not.
It does not change my timetable, but in my mind it confirms my timetable, it supports my timetable. What he's referring to is that for starting in about, I think it was like at the beginning of January of 2012, I came up with a timetable. And I basically said, okay, if this particular moral panic follows the traditional pattern of the way moral panics have gone in the past, we should be looking for funding. We should be looking for around the middle of 2015 for major media outlets to start being able to print stories that not only question specific aspects of the sex trafficking myth, but the whole thing. Not just, oh, well, Somali mom is a problem. Because what we're seeing with Somali is that you're seeing these cases where people are going, oh, but it's so terrible that she did this because trafficking is such a big problem. So in other words, they're ignoring the fact that their idea that trafficking is a big problem comes from people like Somali mom. They haven't made that connection yet. And again, as libertarians, how many times do we see the one bad apple argument with cops? Right? Bradley Balco has that thing where he says, another isolated incident. How many isolated incidents does it take before people see it as a pattern? All right? But right now, we're in the period of Somali is the isolated incident. Or so they think. Okay? There was another one, actually, just yesterday. There was a movie called Eden. I don't know if anybody here saw it, but again, it's supposed to be a true story of sex trafficking, and the woman whose book this was based on was revealed as a fraud yesterday. So it's going to take a whole bunch more of those. But I said in my column today, as a matter of fact, that I think there's a lot more journalists out there who are skeptical than let on. I think there's a lot of journalists out there who know it's bogus, but their editors don't allow them to say anything, right? Concern for commercial viability. If the public wants to hear about sex trafficking stories, we can't go telling them the truth. And so I think what's happening is that there's enough editors out there who have been skeptical all along. And they're going to start seizing on these stories and making more big of a deal out of them maybe than otherwise. And so what I expect, and this is again according to my original timetable, but I think it's supported, by this time next year, some outlets, some media outlets, we should expect to start seeing questioning not just the one, not just the Somali mom, but the whole thing. All the underpinnings, all the paradigm itself. I think we should start seeing that by next year. Not that, I don't mean, universally, I mean some outlets. And then I think about 2 years later, roughly, we're going to see it collapse. I think around 2017, we're going to see the funding start to dry up. I think we're going to start seeing all the smaller organizations folding. I think we're going to see the bigger ones start to turn their attention to other things. And they're going to do it diplomatically, of course. Well, we've been saying for years that sweatshops are really a bigger problem than sex trafficking, and since it seems as though sex trafficking is decreasing, we are now going to turn our attention to sweatshops. And so what's going to happen is that some of them are going to start bowing out gracefully, others are going to collapse. But I think by 2019, we should start seeing the TV movies about, sex trafficking, fakery, and things like that. Because that's about what happened with the Satanic Panic. It was about 2 years or so after the complete collapse. Because the complete collapse was in, 92 of the Satanic Panic, 92, 93. And by 94 or so, we were starting to see the TV movies, like about the McMartin trial and things like that. But I do want to point out that the recovery from these things takes a long, long, long time. It's only been in the past 2 years we've been seeing people who were thrown in prison for the Satanic Panic finally getting released. Okay? The San Antonio Four just got released. And that couple, Fran and Dan, I can't remember their last name, but they just got released too. Bernard Barron was only a few years ago. So, I think we're just starting to see, and now you're starting to see reporters doing retrospectives of the Satanic Panic, basically saying, how could people believe in these things so crazy? It's like, yeah, well, you were in high school at the time when all that was going on, fella, or you were in grammar school, so you don't remember. And I was teaching school when it was going on. I do remember, And so I think it's going to be probably 20 years before we really see the public really come to terms with it, before you finally start seeing all the alleged sex traffickers finally being let out of prison, before you start seeing big high-profile articles in that era's equivalent of time, or the New York Times or whatever, basically saying, oh, look at this, we're going to have this psychologist talk about, the sex trafficking hysteria, what caused it and all that. I think it's going to be about 20 years before it's all over. But I think the main panic will implode in about 3 more years. Pass the mic. Oh.
I think sex work has a very tremendous economic importance, especially for young women, lifting some out of poverty, enabling others to go to school and whatnot. I just wonder if maybe you could share some of your own personal experience along that line.
I'll share 2 stories. My own and that of a girl that I've called in my blog Barbie. My own story was simply that I was a librarian, and in 1995, my first husband left me very suddenly with $90,000 worth of bills on a $24,000 a year salary. I was not content to be indentured for the rest of my life. Something had to give. I needed to find something I could do that I was qualified to do, so I could make more money than I could as a librarian. And it was that simple. I had the looks, I became a stripper. And that was that simple. And in less than 2 years, I paid off $90,000 worth of debt. So it was, and I've seen it happen. In fact, I'm going to tell you 3 stories because the other one is too good to pass up. The second one, Barbie. I call her Barbie because that was my husband's nickname for her, actually, my second husband. It was my current husband who was a client. He used to call her Glitter Barbie because she wore these clothes that had a lot of glitter on them. And whenever I gave her a ride in my car, it would shed glitter. And he would say to me when he got in the car later, "Oh, I see Glitter Barbie's been in here again." But Barbie was 28 years old when I hired her, or maybe 27, around that. She was divorced. She had 2 kids, and she had a useless ex-husband, and she had a high school education in South Louisiana. There were exactly two jobs she was qualified to do: escorting and cashier. She had a Catholic upbringing, and so she did not like sex work, but she did it because of her kids. She did it to support her kids. After about 6 months of sex working, she would flake out. And we would always say, "Oh, Barbie's flaking out again," because we could tell what was coming. She'd get short-tempered, she'd get weird, and we knew it was coming. And then one day, she would just not call in. And we wouldn't hear from her for 6 months. During which time, she was working at the Winn-Dixie. Then she would get to the point where the bills started to stack up, and she realized that Winn-Dixie was not going to make it, and she would come back to work again for me for about another 6 months, and the cycle would go back and forth. So she was able to make ends meet with sex work in a way she could never do with the other jobs she was qualified for. And this is, if you look at around the world, this is the economic reality. The economic reality is that even though it's not like one of the stereotypes, of course, one of the two stereotypes, right, that we see, and we're asked to believe that these are both true, and that there's a vast gulf between them. And of course, the truth is just the opposite. The truth is that the gulf is where most of them are, and the two extremes are where almost nobody is. And the one extreme is the girl who is beaten up and enslaved, and all her money is taken away from her by the pimp, right? And the other is the high-dollar call girl that makes so much money that she has a mansion in Florida, a penthouse in New York. These both exist. They are both rare. The majority of sex workers tend to make toward the top of the income range for whatever economic class they would otherwise occupy. So in other words, a working class sex worker who caters to working class men tends to make at the top of the working class range of income. A middle class escort who caters to middle class men tends to make toward the top of the middle class range. Which is much better than she would otherwise possibly make. It's certainly better than I would have made. I mean, it's way better. I made about probably 6 times as much on average as an escort as I made as a librarian. The difference. The third example I was going to use was a woman who was in her early 30s when she came to me. And she was a nurse. An actual RN. She wasn't a nursing student. I thought she was taking a sabbatical. I figured that's why she wanted to work for me, because she was on sabbatical, right? But then I realized that she was still working. She was still working as a nurse. And she would work in Baton Rouge as a nurse, because she lived in Baton Rouge. New Orleans is about 2 hours from Baton Rouge, okay? So she'd come down to New Orleans every weekend. She'd sleep on my sofa. She'd sleep at friends' houses. She told me, I will do calls any hour of the night. Call me any hour, it doesn't matter, wake me up. Anything that's kind of, strange, I'll do that too. Things other people don't want to do, I'll do them. And I said, okay. And when finally we got into our conversation one day, I said, what? I said, don't take offense, and you don't have to tell me if you don't want to. But what's so important? What are you doing? Because I could tell she was clear-headed. I could tell she didn't have a drug habit. She just didn't fit the profile. She told me her son had leukemia. The co-payment was going to be $30,000. She did not have $30,000. She had to earn $30,000. And she would earn it by any means that she had to. And so she worked, and she worked, and she worked, and she worked for about 2 months, 3 months, something like that. And once I knew that, I was really trying to push too, really trying to swing things for her, right? And she would tell me, she'd keep me saying, okay, I've got about 15,000 now. Okay, I've got about 20,000. And finally one day, after a particularly really good all-night call with a very generous person, she called me up the next day and she said, I've got it. I've got the 30,000 now. And I said, so that means you're quitting? And she's like, yeah. And I said, well, I said, man, I'm really ambivalent about this. I said, because on the one hand, I'm really glad that you got the money. That's awesome. On the other hand, boy, you were a good worker, and I'm sad to see you go. But she did. And the epilogue to that is a year later, she calls me up out of the blue, and she said, Maggie, I just wanted to tell you my son's in remission. So it felt really good, to me, that I was able to help her. Because again, what could she have done? Her house was already mortgaged. There was no other option that she had to make that much money that fast. Yeah, she could have gone to work for a nursing pool, and you know how long it would have taken to make an extra $30,000? probably 6 months, a year, during which time her son has leukemia, right? So she wanted to make it fast. And this is just 3 examples of the kind of, yeah, it can be a good, there's lots of stories like that. There's lots of them. I mean, there's many stories like that as there are sex workers. It's just a matter of you, it's the flexibility, it's the more money. And there's a common myth that we don't pay taxes. There are probably some escorts that do not pay taxes. I'm sure there are. But you know what? There's everybody that don't pay taxes, right? You are a fool and an idiot if you do not pay taxes. In fact, there is one sex worker site called Tits and Sass, and they use that like a mantra. Whenever they hear about like a story of somebody getting in trouble, like a strip club owner or something getting in trouble, they'll be like, pay your taxes! Because it's true, it's the Al Capone thing, right? Even if the police don't get you, the IRS will. So you better look like paying your taxes. Okay? But even with that having been said, the extra income, the flexibility, all those things, it's difficult if you can do the work. And not everybody can. It's a good job. It's a good, and this is the thing too, is that the happy hooker and the miserable slave are both equally extreme characters. The majority of sex workers are like the majority workers in any other field, in the sense that it's a job, it's better than the alternatives, they like it better or else they wouldn't be doing it, but it doesn't mean they love it, it doesn't mean that they think it's the greatest thing in the world, it doesn't mean that they're like, woohoo, I get to go to work today, it just means it's, guys would ask me very often, do you like what you do? And I would be, do you like what you do? Because it's the same. Do you like being a traveling salesman? Do you like being an engineer? Do you like being a doctor? Whatever. If you're asking me, would I do this if I weren't getting paid for it? Or if I were independently wealthy? The answer is no. I'd be sitting at home reading or cooking or doing something I enjoy. But if you're asking me, would I rather do this than work in an office? Yeah. Of course. I also wouldn't be doing it. And that's what it boils down to, really. It's not a matter of, it's not an ideal world. We often get these silly people that say things like, no little girl dreams of being a prostitute when she grows up. It's like, yeah, well, how many girls dream of growing up to be a middle manager? How many, it's like, I can just imagine little Susie, oh, when I grow up, I want to be an account executive. I just can't imagine that. If every kid grew up to be what they wanted to be, the entire workforce would be composed of astronauts, ballerinas, firemen, cowboys, school teachers, nurses.
How much do you think the criminalization of sex work has? How much do you think the criminalization of sex work has affected the market price for it?
It's flattened the curve. A lot of times people think